This scene is not supposed to be rendered on the Nintendo 64. The textures are all rendered at 256 by 256, even though the Nintendo 64 can only load full color textures up to 32 by 64 into its texture memory. This should be impossible. Just like how you've probably never seen normal maps and roughness textures rendered on the Nintendo 64. But these all work and even perform well on real hardware. Let me explain. When the Nintendo 64 was created, computers were significantly weaker than they are nowadays. Consequently, a cost-effective real-time rendering machine, such as the home console, would need smart tricks in its hardware design to be able to render good-looking 3D scenes at acceptable frame rates. For this reason, the hardware designers carved out a lot of the basic idea of how a scene is supposed to be rendered for the software developers. Things like vertex colors, texture filtering, UV mapping, and triangle rendering, even texture formats, all had special hardware parts to support their functionality, and you needed to render in a specific way to make use of the support. That means that doing 3D rendering using this intended path is fast and convenient. It is rare that a game would want to wander off the proven path. It also means that rendering is fairly limited. No programmable shaders, a hard limit of 4 kilobytes of texture cache, and even those 4 kilobytes have to be accessed in a limiting manner that makes some texture setups impossible. And it is just the tip of the iceberg. But human ingenuity combined with time is sure to find ways to bend the rules to make a new path. And despite it not being officially recommended, we find that sometimes doing things in weird ways offers unique benefits, and those weird ideas is what we will look at today. After all, efficient code is almost never intuitively understood. Before we can understand how breaking the intended path can benefit us, we have to understand what the intended path even is. The intended path is simple. First, the CPU prepares something called a display list. This is a long list of commands that set up the camera view, places mesh transforming matrix commands, and triangle, texture, lighting, material, and vertex commands alongside some other render properties. This list gets sent off to the RSP, which then processes this list via a thing called microcode. Microcode is provided by the game and can be customized to fit your needs, although in practice most studios barely touched it. Microcode is a micro-sized code file that contains special assembly instructions designed to be fast at computing 3D geometry. The RSP's instructions can process a vector with up to 8 components, letting you do 8 computations at once with just a single instruction. Perfect for processing many triangles, vertices all at once. This microcode doesn't render any output pixels, but it does determine all the triangle equations that decide how textures or colors will be mapped onto the triangle and other miscellaneous render comments for the RDP. The RDP comments are all set in stone. These are all handled by the special hardware parts. Rendering the triangle commands into pixels is the most expensive part, so it makes sense to let special hardware handle it. Even then, it is the slowest process by far. The RDP outputs pixel color and some anti-aliasing into the frame buffer. It also writes the triangle depth values into the depth buffer and tests against the depth buffer for triangle drawing. Afterwards, the frame buffer can optionally be written to by the CPU or the RSP again to do post-processing. Or you could even set up a display list command to read from the frame buffer to feed info back to the RSP or RDP and repeat from previous steps. And then the final step. The video interface takes the frame buffer, applies anti-aliasing and other VI effects such as de-dither, pixel sizes or even blur, and then ships the output off to your TV. Alright. Seems like a lot of work, but software is complex and it needs us to allow all kinds of effects, so this kind of makes sense. Let's start off with some simple ways to disrupt this rendering flow to get new effects, just so you can understand what I want this video to be about. First, right here when we set up the render material, there is nothing preventing us from using any arbitrary piece of data loaded into RAM as a texture. For example, random code or data. You can actually see this exact effect on the GameCube game Metroid Prime, so this isn't even an N64 exclusive trick, but it is especially easy and valuable to pull off on the N64 due to the low amount of memory we have available. This trick is actually also, possibly unintentionally, used in the N64 Zeldas for the Deku Stick. They have an 8x8 texture for the stick, but load a 16x16 sized chunk, leading to other data being read as the texture. It looks great though. This is actually also the reason the deck stick looks different in Majora's Mask. The data it's pointing to has changed. The next trick is one I use excessively, and nowadays our modding tools have native support for it. It lets us skin models so we don't need to make those N64 style limp sausages.
You see how someone stole his kneecaps and took a bite out of his elbow?
When we send the matrix, vertex and triangle command to the RSP, there's nothing stopping us from instead sending 2 matrices for just 1 batch of triangle commands. So what's the benefit of that? Well, we can load half the vertex buffer with matrix 1 active and the other half with matrix 2 active. This is supported simply as a side effect of how microcodes are typically implemented and was even possible in Mario 64. In fact, I did just this with a hex editor a long time ago on an unmodified Mario 64 ROM to show it is possible. Using this trick, we can make triangles deform along animations and get connected, animated limbs almost entirely free of processing costs. This also saves you a ton of triangles, so it is a tragedy this technique took so long to adopt. Not having to close off limbs as they had in most N64 games would have freed up a serious amount of triangles. 30 extra triangles would have gone a long way in a game like Mario Party. Fortunately, they did seem to have this figured out for Smash Bros. 64. Just like it would be a tragedy if you still use the stinky garbage bin chair on your PC. If you're like me and sit 14 hours a day on your computer chair has a huge impact on your overall life quality. I switched to FlexiSpot's C7 Max a couple months ago when they first sponsored me, and it actually improved my life. You can adjust all kinds of things on this chair, like your lower back support, the armrests or the head support for optimal backrest. I actually even homebrewed mine to remove the armrest because I like to sit cross-legged. You also get adjustable seat depth and memory foam cushion alongside a flexible backside to support all kinds of seating positions. Since I kind of work 3 different jobs, my game dev job, making YouTube videos and working on my N64 games, I do need a chair that helps me during these trialing times. They have a 30-day return policy, so you can have a risk-free trial as well as a 10-year warranty to replace any damaged parts. Use my code Kaze50 to get $50 off for the best price. If you have a limited budget, you can also check out their C5 chair, which is a little cheaper and has many of the same options. Or their C7 Morpher, if you're looking for something more luxurious. There's actually another cool trick at the texture loading stage. There's nothing stopping us from rendering directly onto a texture. This lets us implement a modern rendering pipeline for a surface. Render the output over a texture and get properties like normal maps or metallic maps. I've done that right here for this Mario Odyssey-esque coin, and it runs full frame rate on a real N64. Obviously, this would be very expensive to render for thousands of pixels still, but there's one very cool simplification we can make. Palette textures. With a palette of 256 or even just 16 pixels, we would only need to run the PBR pipeline on these few pixels and they get a decent looking and very cheap output. Doriel has shown me this cool usage of that technique and it looks awesome, plus it costs basically nothing. This technique is actually cheap enough to a point where you can realistically use it across a whole game to get an entirely modern rendered looking video game on the Nintendo 64, provided you don't need smooth shading anywhere. This would limit you to exclusively man-made angular structures, but it would be insanely cool to see. Another trick is right here, where it computes the color. There are a couple bugs or properties, the line between the two is blurry, that emerge from the combiner, and there's actually so many that I have an entire video dedicated to this. You should watch that too. You can do some cool stuff like bloom, these cotton candy-esque materials, or even Mario Galaxy's appearing paths. When the RDP outputs a pixel to the frame buffer at this step, it outputs it in RGBA 16 format across 2 bytes. This format has 5 bits per color channel and 1 bit for alpha. But there is no such thing as transparent video output. So really there's only 15 bit of color information and 1 extra bit. In addition to this extra bit, the N64 actually has a hidden 9th bit in every byte that is used by the render output as well. These 3 extra bits are used by the RDP by outputting a coverage value that is later used to apply anti-aliasing, which blends triangles with less of a staircase pattern. But you can absolutely disable the anti-aliasing in the video interface and instead use those 3 bits to mark special properties similar to a modern stencil buffer. The most straightforward example of this technique I've ever seen comes from Hail to the Dongo's water effect. The water material itself sets these special bits to the correct value, to mark the rendered 2 pixels. He can then identify which pixels were tagged by the water material and shift them around in a wave-like motion. A much more contrived example of this is Majora's Mask's Lens of Truth. Majora's Mask specifically, Ocarina of Times, is much simpler. It does some magic. Much too complicated to be part of this video to ensure transparent geometry plays nice with the lens effect that manipulates the coverage values. Let me know if you'd like a separate video dedicated to that, because it really would have to be a full video. Of course, you can also use your coverage values as a stencil for any kind of other effects you would like. It is actually possible to read the hidden bits with the CPU on the Nintendo 64, although this is such a crazy feature that no emulator, not even Analog 3D's FPGA, implements this behavior yet. It's also very expensive because reading the hidden bits is not cheap, so who knows if anyone will ever make use of this. A simple effect, hacking with the depth buffers, can be seen here with Patchmaker's Workshop's portals. Simply render a scene once, then clear the depth buffer only in the small part, and fill it everywhere else with the closest value, and then render the scene a second time. This will cause the second scene to only render in the small square, which gives you this cool portal effect. Well, at least that's one easy way to do it. I don't actually know if this is exactly what he did. Maybe with the help of the tricks from this video, you can think of a cheaper way of doing it. There's actually even more hackery to the RDP step. I need to ask you, what is a triangle? I know it sounds like a stupid question, but it is an important one. Typically, you would say it is the shape made by connecting 3 dots. But 3 dots is not practical to work with. That's why the RDP has its own format to describe what a triangle is, which consists of mathematical formulas. These formulas let the RDP evaluate triangles much quicker than it ever could by supplying a set of points. This format can represent triangles, but it can also represent some less identifiable shapes. All these shapes shown here are valid RDP triangles. Usually RDP triangles are computed by the microcode, but there is technically nothing stopping you from just making an abomination yourself. RDP triangles come in many shapes and forms. You can do this, for example, to draw a quad with just one triangle. And in fact, internally, the UI rectangle command and the F3D microcode family are making use of this. But by manually making one, you can supply things like vertex colors to the rectangle, which is typically not possible on official Nintendo microcode. Wise Guy, who recently finished the Banjo-Kazooie recompilation, let me know that apparently GoldenEye uses this for its guy. Very cool. This technique would be perfect for Mario 64's Gradient Hunt too, and would save you a lot of texture memory. You can also insert render checks after the frame buffer is rendered, or even feed the frame buffer back into the render and jump to an earlier point into the pipeline. The coolest example of this is probably what Hail to the Dongo has been doing. Since you can run any logic you want on these pixels here, you can also pull off any effect you want. Hail to the Dongo has examples like HDR rendering or even bloom. Of course, these are very expensive effects, but the result is worth it. There is one kind of weird render hack you can do on the VI to increase image clarity. See, usually the Nintendo 64 comes with a horizontal blur you're not supposed to be able to turn off. It blurs pixels horizontally to upscale the output image. A 320 by 240 rendered image actually gets output as a 640 by 240, with every other pixel being a blur of the 2 neighboring pixels. For the longest time, I did not know of a way to turn it off, and I didn't even know it existed. But the homebrew community pointed this out to me, and there's a funny way of turning it off. You simply provide a slightly wrong frame buffer scale to the VI, and the blurring algorithm ends up working out to no longer blur pixels. We did basically nothing at all, and it instantly looks so much sharper. There's one more thing I want to bring up, and I teased this in the beginning, because it basically turns the entire rendering pipeline upside down. And that is Hail to the Dongo's high resolution rendering pipeline. He figured out a way to modify this rendering pipeline to render much higher resolution textures. He implemented this with 256 by 256 textures in full color format, which is 32 times higher than the Nintendo 64 usually can do. Look at that insane difference. And the craziest part is that the actual final output is basically entirely drawn without the RDP. The way he explained it is actually awesome and much simpler than you would think. He simply has the RDP draw colored gradients instead of textures into a frame buffer. And then he uses the color values of the pixels that were drawn as X and Y coordinates for a texture to look up a pixel from. He can index into multiple textures, for example by storing the texture ID into the red channel, and the X coordinate into the blue channel, and the Y coordinate into the green channel. He simply iterates all pixels to generate a whole new image based off the first rendered buffer. This does have the disadvantage that it adds an additional constant cost to the render, of course, but man, this effect definitely has a use case, and seeing a full game take advantage of this would be so cool. Thank you for watching! I am also developing Nintendo 64 games. If you would like to see me take advantage of some of this knowledge, drop a subscribe. Shoutouts to all my patrons for supporting my channel and Dev Journey. Admittedly, these hacks are seldom useful in a full game context, as many require a game to be designed around it, but I still find these really cool to see, and I still will make use of some of these. My game is slowly nearing completion. I just about finished the first pass of the overworld, and I'm finishing most of the side levels right now, and then it's really just polishing work. That's it, bye bye.